y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. Grain direction. It's a simple topic, right? There's not that much to it. Apparently, there's a lot more to it. Let's dive in. Grain direction is a simple topic. Grain is the way that the fibers run in the board, right? But apparently, after doing a recent video, there's a lot more to this. In that video, I said, one of the fantastic things about sandpaper is you can sand with and against the grain. And then I got a whole bunch of questions saying, wait a second, does wood have a grain direction? And I said, yes. So today we're kind of going back to the basics. However, this is one that I'm going to go a little deeper into and talk about some different things that you don't always hear. The easiest way I've found to describe grain direction is imagine this is the hair on the back of a dog. All of the grain in this wood isn't going perfectly straight. Every now and then a fiber will come out the side of the board as the grain will run up or down the face of the board. So if you kind of imagine this to be the hair on the back of a dog, you would pet it in one direction, all the hair would lay down. But if you pet the dog in the other direction, now all those hairs are sticking up and catching on your hand as you go. That's grain direction. You want to plane it in one direction, but not in the other direction. That grain being lifted up when you pet the dog the wrong direction is what we would call tear out. It's when those fibers get lifted up and actually break away from the subsurface that they're laying down on, and when those break off, you get this chip in there. Sometimes that chip out is really, really small, very hard to see, and sometimes it's glaringly obvious and it can ruin a whole piece. There's a really cool old video from a Japanese university. I'll try and leave a link to it down below. And it's one I'm actually trying to duplicate. And hopefully here, Jeff and I will be able to redo that with a much better camera system. But stay tuned. And in a little bit, I'll be going into how to stop tear out and what are some of the things that can be done to make it better or worse, or why it doesn't matter for some tools. But before I get into that, let's back up to the basics. One of the big reasons why a lot of people don't know about grain direction is with power tools, it's something you don't have to think about as much. Now, yes, it's very important. It's something you should be thinking about, but you can get away with it a lot because when a saw is taking out a cut, it's taking out these tiny little shavings, piece after piece after piece, and if it goes against the grain, you're not going to get a horrible tear out from it. Now, you will always get a better finish going with the grain, but you can kind of get away with it with power tools. Hand tools, on the other hand, are not forgiving. If you're using a plane or a chisel, you have to know which direction the grain is going so that you know which direction you use the tool. Because if you go in the other direction, you're just going to cause yourself more problems. Now, yes, there are times when you can't get away from it. You just have to go against the grain, but there are other ways to modify it. So let's take a look at some examples of the grain. This piece of pine is one of the straightest grains I have in my shop. It is beautifully straight, and this actually came out of a construction piece of 2x4. But even this, with the perfectly straight grain, if you follow one of these grains from one end to the other, it slowly rises out and disappears. On the face of the board that will show as cathedrals, you can imagine these as kind of flaps that are either sticking out or sticking into the board. Looking at the cathedrals, you can't tell which direction the wood is growing in this face because it could be leaning towards you or away from you. But if I were to look at it from the side, you can see how all the grain is actually running down that way. That means on this face, I'd want to plane it this way, and on this face underneath, I'd want to plane it that way. The fibers are actually sticking up this way, so a lot of times you can just look at the side of the board and know which way the grain is going. Here's a great piece of Filipino mahogany, and you can see the grain is rising out this way. So the fibers are running from this corner up to this direction. So you'd want to plane the top here that way. But then sometimes it comes to oak, and this one can be very, very hard to tell which way is the grain going because there's just so much going on. All of these tiny little dots in here, those are the medullary rays, and those really don't tell you anything about grain direction. So most of the time what I do is I take a plane shaving and I see, does it go one way or the other? Often the best way to tell is with your ear. So I'm going to take the plane and go this way. That was pretty nice. A bit of a zippy sound to it. Let's flip the board around and see what we get. It's a little harder to push. I'm actually getting a thicker curl and oh my, look at that surface. You can see here, this is really bad tear out. There isn't a spot on this surface that isn't in tear out. I'm just getting this rough, horrible, almost like a rough sawn edge. But if I take the plane to it and go in the other direction, one pass, I'm gonna take a couple to get rid of this. That sounds better. And now that same location of the board, we have a nice, smooth, clean surface. just by flipping the board around. Most of the time I tell grain direction by just taking the plane and seeing what the first shaving does and listening to it, feeling it. And you start to feel and hear that tear out and you realize, oh, nope, that's bad. A lot of times I'll just take like a ½ inch of shaving and realize, oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Let's flip that board around and then go the right direction. But then the problem comes when you rough dimension a board and you get it really, really close to its final dimensions. And then you need to come back and do the final smoothing later on, and you've forgotten which direction the grain is going, and you really don't want to take off any more material than you have to. You just want to take one pass to smooth it out, clean it, and get it back to surface. That's why sometimes when I'm doing the rough dimensioning on it, I'm actually going to label it to know which direction the grain goes. A very old way to mark it is to have an arrow pointing at the corner, and then on this side you put in a curlicue, and this tail shows the direction of the grain. So I want to plane in that direction. Though I've heard people argue that you want to plane in that direction, as long as you know which direction your curlicue is, that's the direction it should go. This particular mark is incredibly old, and you will find some people arguing about the curlicue needs to go on the edge and the arrow in the face, and others will tell you this curlicue is actually the remnants of an old F for face. However, this mark is older than the English language, and the mark is often used in other languages other than English. Another great way that people have for finding the direction is you get a pair of pantyhose, and you rub the hose over it. One direction, you can hear it grabbing, and the other direction, it runs nice and smoothly. So you know against the grain and with the grain. Here I'm actually using a cotton swab, and it does the same thing. You can hear it grabbing the fibers in one direction, but not in the other direction. On most woods, you can just look at the grain and have a pretty good idea which direction it's going to go. Though there are a lot of woods that will lie at you, and you think, yes, it's definitely going that direction, then you try it out and it's like, oh, nope, it's the other direction, let's go back the other way. So it's kind of one of those things you have to experiment with, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Sometimes you can't always avoid it. You have to go against the grain. And in particular on oak and other trees that have wild grain that goes all over the place, sometimes you'll have it going in one side and coming out the other side. And so if you plane from one end to the other, you'll be going with the grain here and against the grain over there, or vice versa. And so how do you plane a board when the grain goes up and down and up and down and you're going with and against and with and against? Not to mention curly grain. There are some tools that really don't matter, like the card scraper or sandpaper. You can go with and against the grain. You probably don't want to go across it, but with and against the grain, not a problem at all. The card scraper will give you really nice curls. Doesn't matter which way you're going, you can clean up a surface very nicely. But why exactly does that happen? Why does a card scraper make it so that you can actually go against the grain? It's honestly for the same reason that sandpaper will do it. The curl, as it's coming along the board, actually hits a tiny little blade on the front edge of that, and it will curl up quickly, and that actually compresses the curl back into the wood and pushes it down. So even if you're going against the grain, it twists it back and breaks it over. That's the same thing that a chip breaker does on a standard plane. It catches that curl and forces it back down in the wood, and it'll actually break it off. That's why it's called a chip breaker. It's ahead of the iron so that the iron can come through and shear it off cleanly. With a standard plane, there are basically 4 things you can do to make it better. Now, first, the biggest and most important, no matter what you do, is to have the blade sharp. If that blade isn't sharp, it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to get a clean surface. And I'm not talking it has to be sharp. I'm not talking it has to be shaving sharp. I'm saying it has to be sharp beyond what most people think is sharp. And then you have to take a very, very light pass. Sharp and light pass will eliminate almost all tear out. But there are some woods where even sharp and light pass have problems. And the modern plane has 3 more tools that can help you fight that. Number 1, I talked about this earlier, it's got a chip breaker on it. That will allow the curl to come up, hit the blade, and curl back, forcing it so the blade can cut it off. To actually see that under a microscope is really, really cool. It was that video I was talking about from a Japanese university. You've got to take a look at it. Otherwise, I'm hopefully going to be getting a video out here soon to show that in microscope. It's really phenomenal, kind of cool. The second thing you can do is you can actually close up the mouth. The tighter your mouth is, the more the plane is actually holding the fibers down in front of the cut so they don't have a tendency to peel up ahead of the blade. The mouth still holds them flat so that the blade can come in and shear them off. And the third thing you can do is the angle of cut. The higher the blade angle is, the more that curl is getting compressed and forced back down the wood so you get a cleaner cut. With a modern Bailey style plane, you can adjust all 3 of those and really get a plane that's incredibly tight. And I've never actually come across a wood where this won't plane against the grain if I take the time to really set it up. And I've got a video on setting up a smoothing plane to do that. I'll leave a link to that one down below. With a low angle plane, you can fix 2 of those problems. Number 1, you can close the mouth, and closing the mouth in this one is really, really easily. Number 2, you can actually adjust the angle of attack by changing out your iron and getting a higher angle. And that will do for a lot of things. But sometimes I found that there are times where even with both of those in place, this just can't do the job because it doesn't have a chip breaker to actually break the chip. And so that's why most of the time when I'm doing really difficult wood, I'm not going to grab one of these. This is what I'll grab. It's a much better tool for the job. But honestly, that's really, really rare that you have to go to that extreme of a condition. But the cool thing is when you're dimensioning lumber and you're taking it down to its rough shape, a lot of times I don't even worry about tear out. I just plan on getting tear out. Most of my large planes that I use for dimensioning stock and taking off material, they take off large chunks. They have a big open mouth. I'm taking a deep cut because I'm removing material and I know I'm going to get tear out. And then once I get it close to my dimensions, then I'm going to come in with a plane that I've set up really well, and I'm going to get rid of that tear out and bring it right down to the final dimension. And so that's why it's a smoothing plane. It's not a dimensioning plane, because you're just smoothing it out. You're getting rid of the tear out at the end. But before all of that, usually I just try and avoid the tear out by just going with the grain. And as long as I can just go with the grain, it's not a problem. But that means you have to understand which direction the grain is going. And then you have to understand the very basic that wood does have a grain. And I'm surprised how many woodworkers who have been doing it for decades don't know that wood has a grain. Yeah, go look at those comments from the videos I showed earlier. So there you have it. Yes, wood does have a grain direction, and it's one of those amazing things that once you learn how to use it, everything else makes so much more sense. And if you ever want to get into carving and doing detail work, grain direction is incredibly important, because the grain direction is always changing because you're changing the topography of the wood. And grain direction is just something you have to master. Now, if you're just going to be working with power tools, then yeah, sometimes you can forget about it. But sometimes you're going to wonder, well, what is this tear out coming from? Why am I sending it through the thickness planer and I'm always getting these chips on the surface? Most of the time it's because maybe if you turn the board around and send it through the other way, it'll remove the tear out. Because wood does have a grain direction. So I hope you like this, and hopefully you got some new information on this. I know most people on here, this is rather basic stuff, but for a lot of people, it's not. So everyone's got to learn for the first time. I hope you like it. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, snide remarks, or just want to hurt my feelings, throw a comment down below. Thank you. It does help out the channel. I do love reading through those, and I answer as many of them as I can get to. So thank you for that. But if you really want to help out this channel and help us make more videos like this, then think about joining these people over here. Those are some of the patrons on Patreon. And between patrons and members, people who click that thank you button down below, you guys sponsor this channel. You allow me to make the videos I want to make rather than what some company wants me to make. So I hope you like that. And it does mean a lot to me. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. So next time your phone is broken and you happen to be in a weird town in a place that you don't know, you can always stop and ask a tree, because all wood has a direction.